The porcelain spoons clinked against fine Belgian china 4 times at Christmas Eve, each gentle sound masking the deadly purpose behind every carefully prepared dish. By dawn on December 25, 1908, 4 bodies would lie still beneath flickering candlelight while their cook walked silently into the Congo rainforest, leaving behind only empty plates and the lingering taste of justice served cold. This is the story of how one woman transformed from kitchen servant to executioner, using nothing more than her knowledge of the forest and a Christmas feast that would become the Vandenberg family's last meal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The humid air of the Belgian Congo carried more than just the scent of rubber trees and river water in December of 1908. It carried the weight of secrets, suffering, and the kind of rage that simmers quietly for years before reaching its boiling point. 15 kilometers southeast of what the colonizers called Elisabethville, where the dense rainforest pressed against cleared plantation land like a green wall holding back the wilderness, the Vandenberg rubber estate sprawled across thousands of hectares of stolen earth. The morning mist that rose from the Congo River's tributaries seemed to whisper of old injustices, while the constant sound of workers tapping rubber trees provided a rhythmic backdrop to daily brutality that had echoed across this land for over a decade. The compound itself stood as a monument to colonial arrogance, its 2-story main house rising from the red earth like a transplanted piece of Brussels, complete with wraparound verandas and imported Belgian tiles that baked under the African sun. Separate from the main house, connected by a covered walkway that offered some protection from the frequent tropical downpours, stood the kitchen building where the real heart of the household operations took place. Here, among wood-burning stoves and hanging bundles of local herbs, the daily transformation of raw ingredients into meals that sustained the colonial enterprise occurred under the watchful eye of someone who had learned to hide her true thoughts behind a mask of perfect compliance. Amara Kilonga had first drawn breath in this hostile world 24 years earlier, not in the servant quarters where she now slept, but in the village of Kasai, 2 days' walk through forest paths that the colonizers had never learned to navigate. Her earliest memories were not of servitude but of freedom, of helping her grandmother gather medicinal plants in the early morning light, of learning which roots could heal and which could harm, of understanding the delicate balance between life and death that existed in every leaf and berry the forest provided. Those memories felt like dreams now, distant and almost unreal after 16 years of forced domesticity, but the knowledge her grandmother had passed down remained sharp and clear, waiting for the right moment to be put to use. The transformation from free child to house servant had begun on a day that started like any other in 1892, when 8-year-old Amara was playing by the river's edge while her mother washed clothes and her father prepared nets for the evening fishing. The sound of approaching horses had sent the adults into immediate panic, but for a child who had never seen colonial soldiers, the sight of uniformed men on horseback seemed almost magical until the reality of their purpose became clear. The raid that followed lasted less than an hour, but its consequences would reshape the region forever, scattering families across the Congo like seeds thrown into barren ground. Peter Vandenberg had been among the officers that day, a younger man then, eager to prove himself in the colonial service and build the fortune that would eventually establish his rubber empire. He had personally selected Amara from among the captured children, noting her quick intelligence and apparent docility, qualities he believed would make her valuable as a domestic servant once properly trained. What he had failed to recognize even after all these years was that docility learned through necessity was not the same as genuine submission, and that intelligence, when suppressed but not destroyed, could become a weapon more dangerous than any rifle or whip. The Vandenberg household operated with the mechanical precision of a colonial machine designed to extract maximum profit from human suffering. Peter himself, now 45 and grown soft around the middle from years of imported Belgian beer and native labor, ruled the estate with the casual cruelty of a man who had never questioned his right to own other human beings. His wife Marguerite, 38 and sharp-featured from years of tropical heat and constant vigilance against native uprising, managed the household staff with the same attention to detail she might have applied to managing livestock, viewing each servant as an investment that required careful monitoring to ensure proper return. Their 2 sons represented the next generation of colonial exploitation, each trained from childhood to view the Congolese people as natural resources to be harvested like rubber or copper. Henri, The elder at 22 had inherited his father's casual brutality along with his position as heir to the plantation, while Jules, 19 and perhaps the cruelest of the family, had developed a particular talent for psychological torment that made even the other colonizers uncomfortable during their occasional social gatherings. What united the Vandenberg family beyond blood and shared wealth was their complete inability to see the humanity in the people who served them, cooked their food, maintained their property, and made their comfortable lives possible. To them, Amara was simply part of the household infrastructure, as essential and unremarkable as the stove she operated, or the water she drew from the well. This blindness would prove to be their fatal mistake, because it prevented them from noticing the gradual changes that had been occurring in their most trusted servant over the months leading up to that December evening. The kitchen where Amara spent most of her waking hours had become her domain in ways the Vandenbergs never suspected. Beyond the obvious tools of food preparation, she had gradually assembled a collection of implements and ingredients that served purposes far removed from normal cooking. Hidden among the legitimate spices and herbs were small quantities of plants gathered during her carefully planned excursions to collect firewood, each specimen chosen for properties her grandmother had taught her to recognize decades earlier. The knowledge that had once been used to heal her village would find a different application in the service of the family that had destroyed that village. The Christmas season of 1908 had arrived with particular significance for the Vandenberg household, marking not just another year of profitable exploitation, but also Henri's engagement to the daughter of a neighboring plantation owner, an alliance that would expand the family's influence throughout the region. The celebration plans had been elaborate, involving imported delicacies from Belgium, expensive wines, and a feast that would demonstrate the family's prosperity to their colonial peers. Amara had been tasked with preparing the entire Christmas Eve dinner, a responsibility that filled her with satisfaction for reasons the family would never understand. For weeks before Christmas, she had observed the family's routines with new intensity, noting not just their preferences in food and drink but their schedules, their habits, their vulnerabilities. She watched Peter's evening ritual of reviewing plantation accounts in his study while consuming substantial quantities of imported brandy. She noted Marguerite's custom of taking laudanum for her frequent headaches, a habit that left her drowsy and inattentive during evening hours. She studied Henri's tendency to overindulge in wine during celebrations and Jules's preference for the sweet desserts that would mask any unusual flavors. The planning phase had required not just botanical knowledge but also careful psychological manipulation, ensuring that the family would be in exactly the right state of relaxation and trust when the moment arrived. Amara had gradually increased the richness and complexity of her cooking over the preceding weeks, training the family's palates to expect elaborate flavors that would disguise any foreign elements in their final meal. She had also begun incorporating small amounts of harmless but bitter plants into their food, conditioning them to accept unusual tastes as part of her increasingly sophisticated culinary artistry. December 23 marked the beginning of the final phase of her preparation, as guests began arriving for the extended Christmas celebration and the household settled into the rhythm of festivity that would provide perfect cover for her actions. The kitchen became a hub of activity, with Amara directing the work of preparing multiple courses while maintaining her facade of grateful servitude. She smiled appropriately when complimented on her cooking skills, bowed her head respectfully when given instructions, and gave no sign that she was methodically planning the destruction of everyone she served. The evening of December 24 began like
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Countless others, with the family gathering in the main dining room for what they assumed would be another pleasant meal in their comfortable colonial existence. The table had been set with the finest china, imported crystal glasses catching the light from European candles, silver cutlery polished to mirror brightness. The room itself reflected the family's wealth and status, with paintings of Belgian landscapes on the walls and furniture that had been shipped across an ocean to recreate a piece of Europe in the heart of Africa. Amara moved through her duties that evening with the practiced efficiency of years of service, presenting each course with perfect timing while her mind calculated dosages and monitored the family's consumption of both food and alcohol. The appetizer course consisted of imported pâté, enhanced with local mushrooms, chosen specifically for their ability to mask earthier flavors. The main course featured roasted fowl with a complex sauce that incorporated both European herbs and African plants in proportions that seemed merely exotic rather than dangerous. As the meal progressed and the family's conversation grew louder and more animated under the influence of wine and brandy, Amara felt the strange calm that comes with absolute commitment to a course of action. She had crossed a psychological threshold weeks earlier, moving from the passive endurance that had characterized her entire adult life to active preparation for an act that would fundamentally change everything. The woman who had once accepted brutality as inevitable had been replaced by someone who understood that some forms of justice could only be achieved through decisive action. The dessert course provided the perfect vehicle for her final preparations, a rich chocolate confection flavored with imported vanilla and enhanced with what appeared to be traditional African spices but were actually carefully measured amounts of plant extracts that would ensure none of the diners would survive to see Christmas morning. The family consumed their portions with enthusiasm, complimenting Amara on her exceptional skills and discussing their plans for the following day's festivities while unknowingly sealing their own fate with every spoonful. By the time coffee was served, the psychological transformation of Amara Kalonga from servant to instrument of justice was complete. She stood in the doorway between kitchen and dining room, watching the family laugh and celebrate while the mechanisms of their destruction began working in their bloodstreams, and felt not triumph but a profound sense of balance being restored to a world that had been tilted wrong for far too long. The coffee grew cold in delicate porcelain cups as the Vandenberg family retired to their respective quarters, unaware that death now moved through their veins with the same methodical precision Amara had applied to every aspect of their final meal. The grandfather clock in the main hallway chimed 11 times, its sound echoing through rooms that would soon fall silent forever. Amara remained in the kitchen, washing dishes and cleaning surfaces with the same meticulous care she had always shown, but now each action carried the weight of finality. She was no longer preparing for tomorrow's breakfast or planning next week's menu. She was erasing evidence and preparing for a journey that would take her far from the only home she had known for 16 years. The plantation compound settled into its familiar nighttime rhythm, with the sounds of the forest gradually overtaking the domestic noises of the day. Night birds called from the canopy above, their voices mixing with the distant drums that connected village to village across the vast network of forest communities. Most colonizers dismissed these drums as primitive entertainment, never suspecting they carried news, warnings and coded messages that moved faster than any European communication system. Tonight those drums would eventually carry news of the Vandenberg family's fate to settlements throughout the region, but for now they simply provided the soundtrack to Amara's final hours as a house servant. The transformation that had been building within her for months reached its completion as she moved through the familiar spaces of the kitchen building. Every knife had its designated place, every pot its proper shelf, every surface its expected level of cleanliness. She had maintained these standards for years, not out of any respect for her captors but because precision and attention to detail had become her weapons against a system designed to reduce her to nothing more than a tool for others' comfort. Tonight that same precision would serve a different purpose entirely. Marguerite Vandenberg had been the first to retire, complaining of a headache that she attributed to the excitement of the evening and the rich food they had consumed. She had taken her usual dose of laudanum, and retreated to the master bedroom, where her husband would join her after finishing his evening review of plantation accounts. The medication combined with the substances Amara had carefully incorporated into the meal would ensure that whatever discomfort came later would be brief and final. There would be no screaming, no struggle, no opportunity for the woman who had ordered countless beatings and humiliations to call for help or attempt escape. Peter himself remained in his study longer than usual, absorbed in ledger books that recorded the previous year's rubber production in terms of tons extracted and native laborers consumed. The numbers told a story of remarkable profitability, with production quotas exceeded and cost minimized through the simple expedient of working people to death and replacing them with fresh captures from increasingly distant villages. He sipped brandy while reviewing these figures, occasionally making notations in his careful handwriting, completely oblivious to the fact that this would be his final accounting. The two Vandenberg sons had moved their celebration to the veranda, where they continued drinking while discussing their plans for expanding the family's operations into new territories. Henry spoke enthusiastically about a proposed partnership with copper mining interests that would require additional forced labor, while Jules described his vision for a trading network that would stretch from the Atlantic coast to the inland territories where Belgian influence remained limited. Their voices carried clearly through the still night air, reaching Amara in the kitchen where she listened to them plan future atrocities while the poison she had administered began its slow but irreversible work. The botanical knowledge her grandmother had passed down included detailed understanding of timing and dosage, crucial information for both healing and its opposite application. The plants Amara had chosen for this evening's purpose were not the quick-acting varieties that might have aroused suspicion or allowed for intervention. Instead, she had selected species that would work slowly and systematically, creating symptoms that would initially seem like natural illness but would progress inevitably toward the desired conclusion. The family would have perhaps an hour of normal activity before the first signs appeared, followed by a gradual decline that would leave them helpless to summon assistance or identify the cause of their condition. As midnight approached, Amara began her own final preparations for departure. From various hiding places throughout the kitchen and servant quarters, she retrieved items she had been accumulating over the past several weeks. A small leather pouch contained gold coins stolen one at a time from household funds, enough to purchase supplies or passage should the opportunity arise. A bundle of clothing included both her own simple garments and pieces taken from the laundry that might help her blend in among different populations during her flight. Most importantly, she had assembled a collection of plant materials and traditional medicines that would sustain her during the journey ahead and potentially serve other purposes should she encounter obstacles along the way. The forest beyond the plantation boundaries held both promise and danger for a lone woman attempting to navigate its depths without proper preparation. Amara understood that survival would depend not just on her knowledge of edible plants and clean water sources, but on her ability to avoid the various threats that made the wilderness hazardous even for experienced travelers. Colonial patrols occasionally ventured short distances into the forest when pursuing escaped workers, while traditional hunting parties from various village communities moved through territory they had claimed for generations. Most dangerous of all were the bands of displaced people who had turned to violence after losing their homes to colonial expansion, groups that might view any stranger as either threat or opportunity. The sound of retching from the main house interrupted her preparations, followed by confused voices and the heavy footsteps of someone stumbling through hallways in distress. The poison had begun its work ahead of schedule, possibly accelerated by the alcohol consumption that had accompanied dinner. Amara paused in her packing to listen more carefully, trying to determine which family member had been affected first and whether the others were beginning to experience symptoms as well. The information would help her judge how much time remained before the household descended into complete chaos. Henry's voice rose in panic as he called for his parents, his earlier confidence replaced by the fear of someone who suddenly realized that something was seriously wrong but could not identify the source of the problem. The sound of breaking glass suggested that coordination and balance were already compromised, while the absence of response from the master bedroom indicated that both Peter and Marguerite were beyond offering assistance to their sons. The systematic nature of the family's collapse confirmed that Amara's calculations had been accurate and her execution flawless. The practical aspects of her escape route had been planned with the same attention to detail she had applied to the evening's meal. Rather than attempting to reach the main road which would be heavily patrolled once the bodies were discovered, she intended to follow forest paths that connected the plantation to traditional village sites miles away from colonial influence. Her grandmother's people had maintained these routes for generations, using them for trade, communication and seasonal migrations that followed patterns older than any European presence in the region. The paths were nearly invisible to outsiders but clearly marked for those who knew what to look for. Among the items in her traveling bundle was a small carved figure her grandmother had given her years before the colonial soldiers arrived, a representation of forest spirits that was supposed to provide protection during dangerous journeys. Amara had hidden the carving throughout her years of forced service, knowing that its discovery would have resulted in severe punishment for maintaining traditional religious practices. Tonight it would serve its intended purpose for the first time, offering not supernatural protection but the psychological comfort of connection to her original identity and culture. The drums in the distance had changed their rhythm, shifting from the standard evening communications to patterns that suggested news was being transmitted between settlements. Amara wondered whether the change was related to events at the plantation or simply reflected normal community business, but either way the sound provided reassurance that the forest network remained active and aware of developments throughout the region. When she eventually made contact with traditional communities, those drums would carry her story far beyond the reach of colonial authorities. The cries from the main house had grown weaker and less frequent, suggesting that the most acute phase of the family's suffering was drawing to a close. Amara felt no satisfaction in their pain, only a grim recognition that justice sometimes required methods that civilized society preferred to ignore or condemn. She had not chosen this path out of sadistic pleasure or simple revenge, but because years of careful observation had convinced her that the Vandenberg family would continue their brutal exploitation indefinitely unless someone took decisive action to stop them. The final items she retrieved before leaving the kitchen forever were the most important for her long-term survival. Hidden beneath loose floorboards was a collection of seeds saved from various plants over the years, varieties that could be cultivated in forest clearings or village gardens to provide both food and medicine. These represented not just emergency supplies but the possibility of establishing a new life somewhere beyond colonial reach, perhaps contributing her botanical knowledge to communities that valued such skills rather than taking them for granted. As she prepared to step outside for the last time as the Vandenberg family's servant, Amara reflected on the strange path that had brought her to this moment. The 8-year-old child who had been captured beside the river would barely recognize the woman she had become, someone capable of calculated murder, executed with scientific precision. The transformation had been gradual and almost invisible, occurring in small increments over years of accumulated injustices until the final catalyst pushed her across a line she could never uncross. The main house had fallen completely silent now, its windows dark except for the flickering light of candles that would eventually burn down to nothing, leaving the Vandenberg family in the permanent darkness they had brought to so many other lives. Amara shouldered her traveling bundle and walked away from the compound without looking back, her bare feet silent on the forest path that would carry her toward an uncertain but self-determined future. The Belgian colonial system in the Congo operated on principles that its architects preferred not to examine too closely, built as it was on the fundamental assumption that European civilization gave its representatives the right to extract wealth from African people and territories through any means necessary. The Vandenberg plantation represented just one small component of this vast machine of exploitation, but its sudden dysfunction would send ripples throughout the local administrative network as officials tried to understand what had happened and prevent similar incidents. The morning discovery would trigger investigations, manhunts and ultimately policy changes designed to prevent house servants from gaining access to materials or knowledge that might threaten their master's safety. New restrictions would be imposed on native movement, traditional practices would face even harsher suppression, and innocent people would suffer punishment for Amara's actions. She understood these consequences and accepted responsibility for them, recognizing that challenging systems of oppression always carries costs that extend far beyond the immediate participants. The forest path wound through terrain that most Europeans considered impenetrable wilderness, but which had supported complex networks of trade, communication and cultural exchange for centuries before the first colonial administrators arrived to impose their rigid concepts of civilization and progress. Ancient trees formed a canopy so dense that starlight barely penetrated to the forest floor, while the sounds of countless insects and night animals created a symphony of life that drowned out any noise Amara's passage might have made. Her grandmother's training in forest navigation proved invaluable as she moved through darkness that would have left most people completely disoriented. Traditional wayfinding techniques relied on subtle markers that required years of practice to recognize and interpret, from the way certain vines grew to indicate direction, to the particular calls of nightbirds that marked territorial boundaries between different forest zones. This knowledge, nearly lost during her years of domestic servitude, returned to her consciousness like water flowing into drought-parched earth. The weight of what she had accomplished began to settle over her as she put distance between herself and the plantation compound. 4 lives had ended because of her actions, but how many lives might be saved by the disruption of the Vandenberg family's expansion plans? How many villages might avoid the fate that had befallen her own community 16 years earlier? The moral mathematics of resistance were complex and troubling, but the alternative had been to continue enabling atrocities through passive compliance. The path ahead split into multiple branches, each leading toward different regions and different possibilities for a woman who no longer had any legal identity within the colonial system. She could head toward the river communities that maintained some degree of independence through their control of transportation networks, or strike out for the interior territories where traditional kingdoms still held sway beyond European reach, or even attempt the dangerous journey toward the eastern borders where other colonial powers maintained different but potentially less oppressive regimes. Each choice carried its own risks and possibilities, but for the first time in 16 years, the decision was entirely her own to make. Amara Kilonga stood at the crossroads in the forest darkness, no longer a servant or a victim, but a free woman whose actions had proven that even the most carefully controlled systems of oppression contained vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those with sufficient knowledge, patience, and determination to strike back. The drums in the distance continued their ancient conversations, carrying news and maintaining connections across vast distances through coded rhythms that colonial authorities had never learned to interpret. Soon those same drums would spread word of the mysterious deaths at the Vandenberg plantation, but by then their cause would be far beyond the reach of European justice, moving deeper into a wilderness that had sheltered refugees and resistors long before the first Belgian boots set foot on Congolese soil. Dawn remained hours away, and with it the discovery that would transform 4 deaths into legend and one woman's act of calculated revenge into inspiration for others who had endured too much for too long. But those were concerns for the future, and the future would have to take care of itself. For now, there was only the path forward, the forest ahead, and the hard-won freedom to choose what came next. The morning sun filtered through the forest canopy and scattered beams that illuminated patches of undergrowth where Amara had taken shelter during the final hours before dawn. She had traveled steadily through the night, following paths that seemed to remember her feet even after 16 years of separation from this wild landscape. The sounds of the plantation compound had long since faded behind her, replaced by the complex symphony of forest life that had welcomed her return like an old friend recognizing a voice not heard in decades. Sleep had been impossible despite her exhaustion, not from fear of pursuit but from the strange energy that comes with crossing an irrevocable threshold. Her body remained alert and restless, as if it understood that the woman who had awakened in the servant quarters yesterday morning no longer existed, replaced by someone whose future stretched ahead like an uncharted river flowing toward distant and unknowable destinations. The transformation was complete, but its implications were only beginning to unfold. The bundle of supplies she had carried from the plantation felt heavier now, not from physical weight but from symbolic significance. Each item represented a bridge between her life of captivity and whatever lay ahead, carefully chosen resources that might mean the difference between survival and death in the challenging weeks to come. The stolen coins clinked softly as she shifted position, their metallic sound a reminder of debts both paid and owed, of accounts settled through methods that polite society would never acknowledge or condone. By now the bodies would have been discovered, she calculated, imagining the scene as household staff arrived to begin their daily routines, only to find their employers cold and still in their respective beds. The initial confusion would give way to panic, then to frantic attempts at medical intervention that would prove futile, and finally to the grim realization that something unprecedented had occurred at the Vandenberg plantation. The implications would ripple outward from that moment, affecting not just the immediate community, but the entire regional network of colonial administration. The forest around her stirred with morning activity as nocturnal creatures retreated to their dens and daytime species emerged to claim their territories. Amara recognized many of the sounds from childhood memories, bird calls that had once guided her grandmother's morning plant-gathering expeditions, insect noises that indicated healthy ecosystems undisturbed by colonial interference, the distant splash of river water over stones that promised fresh sources of drinking water and possible fish for sustenance. This wilderness that Europeans feared as hostile and impenetrable had become her sanctuary. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper through the rustling leaves, offering guidance that transcended the purely practical knowledge of plant identification and forest navigation. The old woman had understood that survival in their world required more than just technical skills, demanding a deep psychological resilience that could weather the storms of displacement, violence and cultural destruction that seemed to follow wherever European flags were planted. That resilience had been tested to its limits during Amara's years of servitude, but it had not broken, merely transformed into something harder and more purposeful. The question of what came next required careful consideration of both immediate necessities and longer-term possibilities. Food and water were paramount concerns, but so was avoiding detection by the search parties that would inevitably be organized once the colonial authorities grasped the magnitude of what had occurred. The forest provided abundant resources for those who knew where to look, but it also contained dangers that could prove fatal to the unwary or unprepared. Balance would be crucial, moving far enough to avoid pursuit while remaining close enough to sources of supply and information. Traditional communities throughout the region maintained networks of communication and mutual assistance that operated largely invisible to colonial oversight, systems that had adapted and evolved to survive decades of European interference, while preserving essential cultural practices and knowledge. Amara's childhood connection to these networks had been severed by her capture, but the fundamental structures remained intact, waiting for the right approach and proper introductions to welcome another refugee from colonial brutality. The carved figure her grandmother had given her felt warm in her palm as she held it up to catch a beam of filtered sunlight. The small wooden shape represented more than just spiritual protection, serving as a tangible link to identity and heritage that 16 years of forced assimilation had failed to completely erase. Other survivors would recognize its significance, understanding immediately that she carried legitimate credentials from the traditional culture, rather than being some colonial spy or opportunistic imposter seeking to exploit indigenous hospitality. Stories would already be spreading through the forest communication networks, carried by the drum messages that had continued sporadically throughout the night and the early morning hours. The details might be inaccurate initially, filtered through multiple sources and interpretations, but the essential fact of the Vandenberg family's sudden demise would travel faster than any European messenger could ride. By evening, communities hundreds of miles away would know that something significant had occurred, even if the specifics remained unclear. The psychological weight of her actions settled more heavily as the immediate adrenaline of escape began to subside. 4 human beings had died because of her decisions, their lives ending in pain and confusion despite the relatively gentle method she had chosen. The moral complexity of this reality would require ongoing processing, balancing the legitimate desire for justice against the taking of lives that could never be restored or undone. Her grandmother's teachings had included guidance about the spiritual consequences of causing death, even when justified by extreme circumstances. Traditional concepts of justice operated according to principles that European legal systems often failed to recognize or understand, focusing more on restoration of balance and community harmony than on punishment or retribution for their own sake. From this perspective, Amara's actions could be viewed as a necessary correction to an imbalance that had persisted far too long, removing sources of ongoing harm to restore equilibrium to relationships between different peoples sharing the same landscape. The colonial courts would see only murder, but other frameworks offered different interpretations. The sounds of distant voices carried through the forest, too far away and distorted by vegetation to identify clearly, but suggesting that human activity was occurring somewhere in the direction she had come from during the night. Whether these represented search parties, normal travel or unrelated forest users remained unclear, but their presence served as a reminder that her escape was far from complete. Staying ahead of pursuit would require continuous movement and careful attention to signs that others might be following her trail. Her feet had toughened during the night's journey, remembering skills that house slippers and indoor surfaces had nearly erased. The calluses that had protected her during childhood forest expeditions were long gone, replaced by the soft skin of someone who spent their days on wooden floors and stone hearths. Blisters were already forming, but they would heal and strengthen, just as other aspects of her forest adaptation would develop through necessity and practice. Food became a pressing concern as her stomach reminded her that the previous day's eating had been minimal, limited to small portions tasted while preparing the family's final meal. The forest offered numerous options for someone with proper knowledge, from edible roots and berries to insects and small animals that could be caught and prepared with minimal equipment. Her grandmother had emphasized the importance of dietary diversity during travel, combining different types of nutrition to maintain strength and health during periods of stress and uncertainty. A small stream appeared through the trees ahead, its clear water flowing over smooth stones worn by countless seasons of rain and drought. Amara approached cautiously, listening for signs that others might be using this water source before kneeling to drink and refill the containers she had brought from the plantation. The water was cool and clean, tasting of minerals and forest earth, completely different from the treated supply that had served the colonial compound's needs. Fish moved in the deeper pools where the stream curved around larger rocks, their silver forms darting through shadows cast by overhanging vegetation. With proper equipment and patience, they could provide valuable protein, but catching them would require time and techniques she had not practiced since childhood. For now, plant foods would have to suffice, supplemented by whatever small creatures she might encounter along the path ahead. The bundle of seeds she had saved from years of kitchen work represented possibilities beyond immediate survival, offering the potential to establish agricultural plots wherever she eventually settled. Different varieties required different growing conditions, but the diversity of her collection increased the chances that at least some would thrive in whatever environment she ultimately chose as home. These seeds carried the genetic heritage of plants that had fed her people for generations, preserving biodiversity that colonial agriculture actively sought to eliminate. Midday brought increased heat and humidity as the sun climbed higher in the sky, making travel more difficult but also providing better concealment as the rising air currents dispersed sounds and scents that might otherwise carry to potential pursuers. The forest seemed to pulse with life during these hot hours, insects humming in complex harmonies while larger animals sought shade and water in predictable patterns that could be useful for someone who knew how to read the signs. A clearing appeared ahead, obviously artificial but apparently abandoned for several seasons, with the remains of what might once have been cultivation plots now overgrown with secondary vegetation. Broken pottery and scattered tools suggested this had been a temporary settlement, possibly one of the hidden communities that formed and dissolved as circumstances required. Such places often contained useful resources left behind by previous occupants, but they also represented potential dangers if their abandonment had been recent or involuntary. Amara approached the clearing with extreme caution, circling its perimeter to look for signs of recent activity before venturing into the open space where she would be visible to anyone watching from the surrounding forest. The pottery fragments showed traditional manufacturing techniques, suggesting this had been a community of people maintaining cultural practices rather than colonial refugees or displaced workers. The tools were made from local materials, wood and stone shaped according to patterns that predated European contact. A partially collapsed shelter stood at the clearing's center, its framework still sound despite missing most of its covering materials. The construction methods were familiar from childhood observations of village building techniques, using sustainable approaches that worked with natural materials rather than trying to impose foreign architectural concepts on local conditions. With some repair work, this structure could provide temporary shelter while she considered longer-term options. The afternoon brought new challenges as the forest's character gradually changed, indicating she was moving into territory controlled by different communities or subject to different ecological pressures. The tree species shifted subtly, the undergrowth became denser, and the animal sounds carried different accents that suggested she was approaching boundaries between traditional territories. Such transitions required careful navigation to avoid misunderstandings that could prove dangerous for a lone traveler. Evidence of human passage became more frequent, from footpaths that showed regular use to trees marked with symbols that conveyed information to those who understood their meaning. Some markings indicated resource locations, others warned of hazards or territorial claims, and still others provided directions to settlements or meeting places. Reading these signs required cultural knowledge that 16 years of separation had partially eroded, but basic patterns remained recognizable. The sound of voices ahead caused her to freeze, listening intently to determine whether they represented threat or opportunity. The language being spoken was one of the local dialects rather than French or Flemish, suggesting these were indigenous people rather than colonial personnel. Their tone seemed conversational rather than aggressive, but approaching unknown groups required careful consideration of how to present herself and explain her presence in their territory. Amara decided to announce her approach rather than risk being discovered accidentally, calling out traditional greetings in the dialect she remembered from childhood, while keeping her hands visible to show she carried no weapons. The conversation ahead stopped abruptly, followed by rustling sounds as the speakers moved to positions where they could observe her while remaining concealed themselves. This response was entirely reasonable given the dangerous times and the need for caution when encountering strangers. An elderly man emerged from the vegetation, his appearance marking him as someone who had maintained traditional ways of life despite colonial pressure to adopt European customs. His clothing combined practical forest gear with decorative elements that indicated status within his community, while his bearing suggested the confidence of someone accustomed to making important decisions. Behind him, other figures remained hidden but ready to act if the situation required intervention. The old man studied Amara carefully, his experienced eyes taking in details that would help him assess whether she represented danger, opportunity, or simply another refugee seeking assistance. Her appearance clearly marked her as someone who had been living within the colonial system, but her knowledge of proper greetings and her respectful approach indicated familiarity with traditional protocols. The conversation that followed would determine whether she found allies or was directed to continue her journey elsewhere. In the local dialect, somewhat rusty from disuse but still serviceable, Amara explained her situation in terms that emphasized her original village connections while carefully avoiding specific details about recent events that might implicate her hosts in colonial troubles. She identified herself by her grandmother's name and clan affiliations, providing credentials that could be verified through the extended networks that connected traditional communities throughout the region. The elder listened without interruption, occasionally nodding to indicate understanding but revealing nothing of his own thoughts or intentions. When she finished speaking, he consulted quietly with his hidden companions, their discussion too rapid and idiomatic for her to follow completely. Finally, he turned back to her with a decision that would shape the next phase of her journey toward whatever future awaited beyond the reach of Belgian colonial authority. His words were simple but laden with significance, offering temporary sanctuary while arrangements were made for her to travel deeper into territories where colonial law held no sway. The price would be sharing her knowledge of colonial operations and contributing labor to community needs, terms that seemed entirely reasonable given the risks others would assume by providing assistance. For the first time since leaving the plantation, Amara felt the possibility of genuine safety rather than mere survival. The forest had reclaimed her, just as her grandmother had always promised it would if she remained faithful to the old teachings despite whatever trials might come. The woman who had served poisoned Christmas dinner to the Vandenberg family was already becoming someone new, shaped by different loyalties and guided by different principles than those imposed by 16 years of colonial servitude. Her story would join the countless others that lived in the forest's memory, adding another chapter to the long history of resistance and renewal that defined this ancient landscape. 23 years later, in 1931, a Belgian colonial administrator named Marcel Dubois arrived in what was now called the Belgian Congo to investigate irregularities in historical plantation records. The Great Depression had forced the colonial government to conduct thorough audits of all profitable enterprises, seeking explanations for lost revenues and abandoned properties that might be reclaimed for new exploitation. Among the files that crossed his desk was a folder marked Vandenberg Estate Night Status, Defunct, that contained reports dating back to Christmas Day 1908. The official investigation into the Vandenberg family deaths had concluded with frustrating ambiguity. 4 European colonizers had died simultaneously from what appeared to be acute poisoning, but no conclusive cause had ever been identified. The plantation's kitchen servant, a woman named Amara Kilonga, had disappeared the same night, leading investigators to assume she had either fled in panic or been murdered by the same unknown perpetrators who had killed her employers. The case remained officially unsolved, filed away as another mysterious tragedy of colonial life in dangerous territory. Dubois found himself intrigued by the meticulous nature of the deaths and the complete absence of any surviving witnesses or physical evidence that might explain what had occurred. The investigating officers had searched the plantation thoroughly, questioning every remaining worker and examining every possible source of contamination, but had found nothing that could account for the systematic poisoning of an entire family while leaving their servants unharmed. The mystery had haunted the local colonial administration for years, becoming something of a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers of African service. What the colonial investigators had never understood was that their failure to solve the case represented not incompetence but the fundamental limitations of a worldview that refused to acknowledge the intelligence, capability, and agency of the people they had enslaved. The possibility that a house servant might possess sophisticated knowledge of chemistry and toxicology, that she might plan and execute a complex operation with scientific precision, that she might successfully evade capture through superior understanding of local terrain and culture, simply lay outside the conceptual framework that shaped European thinking about African capabilities. The plantation itself had been abandoned within months of the deaths, as no family members or business partners proved willing to take over operations in a location that had acquired such an ominous reputation. Local workers had refused to return to the compound, spreading stories about vengeful spirits and cursed ground that made recruitment impossible. The buildings had gradually deteriorated under assault from tropical weather and encroaching vegetation, until by 1931 only scattered foundations and overgrown clearings marked the site where the Vandenberg Empire had once flourished. Dubois decided to visit the ruins personally, hoping that direct observation might reveal clues that previous investigators had missed. The journey required traveling by motor vehicle as far as the improved roads extended, then continuing on foot through forest paths that had become increasingly overgrown as colonial development shifted toward more profitable regions. Local guides proved reluctant to approach the site, offering vague explanations about bad spirits and dangerous animals that seemed to mask deeper cultural reluctances. The forest had indeed reclaimed the plantation compound with remarkable thoroughness, as if the earth itself was determined to erase all traces of the colonial enterprise that had once dominated this landscape. Massive trees grew through the foundations of the main house, their roots breaking apart imported stonework and scattering European roof tiles among the undergrowth. Tropical vines had consumed the kitchen building where Amara had prepared her final meal, leaving only suggestive shapes beneath curtains of green vegetation. Standing among these ruins, Dubois began to grasp something that the original investigators had missed entirely. The precision and completeness of the Vandenberg family's destruction suggested not random violence or opportunistic poisoning, but careful planning, executed by someone with intimate knowledge of their habits, their vulnerabilities. and their complete inability to imagine that their most trusted servant might become their most dangerous enemy. This had been an act of calculated justice rather than spontaneous revenge. The implications of this realization troubled Dubois more than he cared to admit. If a single African woman could study her European masters with sufficient care to destroy them utterly while escaping all consequences, what did that suggest about the security of the entire colonial system? How many other servants were observing their employers with similar attention, accumulating knowledge that might someday be turned towards similar purposes? The comfortable assumption of European superiority began to seem less like natural law and more like dangerous self-deception. His investigation led him to interview elderly residents of nearby villages, people who might have been present during the events of 1908, and could provide perspectives that official colonial records had never captured. These conversations proved illuminating in ways he had not anticipated, revealing networks of communication and mutual support that operated entirely outside European awareness or control. The forest communities maintained detailed knowledge of colonial activities, tracking the movements and behavior of administrators, plantation owners, and military personnel with systematic thoroughness. One conversation proved particularly significant. An elderly woman named Mama Therese, who claimed to be approaching her 100th birthday, spoke with unusual directness about events she claimed to remember from her youth. She described a young woman who had appeared in the forest communities sometime around Christmas of 1908, carrying traditional plant knowledge and speaking of justice accomplished through patient preparation rather than violent confrontation. This woman had been welcomed into the network of traditional healers, contributing her skills while learning new applications for botanical knowledge that colonial education had tried to suppress. According to Mama Therese, this mysterious woman had become something of a legend among the forest communities, inspiring other acts of subtle resistance that gradually undermined colonial authority throughout the region. Her methods had been studied and adapted, creating a tradition of invisible warfare that struck at colonial enterprises through means that European investigators could never identify or counter. The knowledge she had shared about using traditional plants for purposes their original discoverers had never intended became part of a growing library of resistance techniques. The story that emerged from these interviews painted a picture of systematic and ongoing resistance that challenged everything Dubois thought he understood about colonial control in the Congo. Rather than the passive acceptance of European authority that official reports described, the indigenous population had apparently been engaged in sophisticated campaigns of economic sabotage, targeted elimination of particularly brutal administrators, and gradual erosion of colonial infrastructure through methods that appeared to be natural accidents or mysterious misfortunes. Dubois realized that his investigation into one historical mystery had uncovered evidence of a much larger and more troubling phenomenon. The colonial system had been under attack from within throughout its entire existence, but the attacks had been so subtle and well disguised that administrators had dismissed them as unfortunate coincidences or inevitable hazards of tropical life. The true scope of indigenous resistance had remained invisible because European cultural assumptions made it impossible to recognize African strategic thinking and long-term planning. The woman who had destroyed the Vandenberg family represented not an isolated incident but an early example of what had apparently become a widespread movement of calculated resistance. Her success had inspired imitators throughout the region, each adapting her basic approach to their own circumstances and opportunities. The cumulative effect of these individual acts had been to make colonial administration increasingly difficult and expensive, forcing the abandonment of remote plantations and the concentration of European activities in more defensible urban centers. As Dubois compiled his report, he faced a dilemma that would have been familiar to colonial administrators throughout Africa and Asia. He possessed information that revealed fundamental weaknesses in the system he was supposed to serve, knowledge that challenged the basic assumptions about European superiority that justified the entire colonial enterprise. Publishing his findings would serve no useful purpose from a colonial perspective, potentially inspiring additional resistance while providing no practical solutions to problems that appeared to be inherent in the structure of imperial control. His final report focused on economic factors that might explain the abandonment of the Vandenberg plantation, carefully avoiding any discussion of the broader patterns of resistance he had uncovered. The mystery of the family's deaths remained officially unsolved, filed away with hundreds of other colonial puzzles that administrators preferred not to examine too closely. The truth about Amara Kalonga's achievement would remain hidden in official archives, known only to the communities that had sheltered her and learned from her example. But truth has a way of surviving even when official histories try to suppress it. In the villages scattered throughout the forest regions of what would eventually become the Democratic Republic of Congo, stories were told that preserved different versions of events, narratives that emphasized agency and successful resistance rather than victimization and helpless suffering. Children grew up hearing about the kitchen servant who had served justice along with Christmas dinner, learning that patience and knowledge could triumph over strength and privilege when applied with sufficient skill and determination. These stories served multiple purposes within the communities that preserved them. They provided inspiration for those facing their own struggles against oppression and injustice, demonstrating that even the most powerless individuals could find ways to strike back effectively against their tormentors. They also transmitted practical knowledge about resistance techniques, encoding information about plants, planning methods, and escape routes in narratives that appeared to be simple entertainment but actually constituted educational curricula for potential freedom fighters. The tradition that Amara had helped establish continued to evolve and adapt as political circumstances changed throughout the 20th century. During the independence movements of the 1960s, many of the techniques pioneered by forest communities during the colonial period proved valuable for urban resistance movements seeking to undermine Belgian authority through economic disruption rather than direct military confrontation. The knowledge of how to strike invisibly and escape undetected became part of the toolkit that eventually enabled successful liberation. By the time the Democratic Republic of Congo achieved independence in 1960, the name Amara Kalonga had become legendary throughout the traditional communities, though her story remained unknown to the European historians who documented the official version of colonial resistance. She represented a different model of heroism than the military leaders and political organizers who received recognition in academic studies, embodying the contribution of ordinary people who found extraordinary ways to fight back against systems designed to crush their spirits and exploit their labor. The forest where she had found sanctuary eventually became part of a national park system, protected ostensibly for conservation purposes but also serving to preserve the cultural heritage of communities that had maintained their independence throughout the colonial period. Deep in those protected woodlands, traditional healers still gathered plants according to knowledge that combined ancient wisdom with innovations developed during decades of resistance activities. Some of that knowledge traced directly back to lessons learned from a kitchen servant who had turned her understanding of food preparation into an instrument of liberation. Visitors to the region today might occasionally encounter elderly residents willing to share stories about the woman who had proved that freedom could be seized rather than merely granted, that justice could be administered through means that oppressors would never anticipate or understand. These narratives serve as reminders that history contains multiple perspectives, that the official records compiled by colonial administrators represent only one version of events that were far more complex and meaningful than European documentation could capture or preserve. The legacy of Amara Kalonga's Christmas dinner extends far beyond the immediate consequences of 4 deaths in a remote plantation compound. Her example helped establish traditions of resistance that influenced liberation movements throughout Central Africa, contributing to strategies that eventually dismantled the entire colonial system. Her story demonstrates that individual acts of courage and creativity can have implications that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances, inspiring others and creating ripple effects that continue long after the original actors have passed from the scene. In the end, perhaps the most significant aspect of her achievement was not the elimination of 4 particularly brutal colonizers, but the proof she provided that supposedly powerless people possess capabilities that their oppressors consistently underestimate. Her success encouraged others to develop their own methods of resistance, contributing to a gradual erosion of colonial authority that made independence movements possible when the historical moment arrived. The kitchen servant who served her master's family their final Christmas dinner had delivered more than poison with that meal. She had served notice that African agency and intelligence would eventually triumph over European arrogance and exploitation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.